Okay, welcome to another day of the second wave of the pandemic, Science and Society. Today we have our second guest speaker, Heather Milo, is the mySci co-lead instructional specialist in the Institute for School Partnership at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research on teacher learning and meaningful science pedagogy has informed the development of a national STEM professional development program and continues to inform her work on science curriculum development. She will discuss her work on developing COVID-19 curriculum for K through 12 students and answer questions about lesson development. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you, Krista. It's really great to be here. And like Krista said, I work at the Institute for School Partnership, which is here in Washington University. We connect Washington University, the resources we have, with the surrounding K-12 community. And we do this in order to inspire and empower educators and students with the resources that they need to succeed, and particularly in STEM fields. And we identify best teaching and learning practices and help teachers implement these practices in local schools, and particularly those schools that are underserved, under-resourced, with the most vulnerable students in the community. And so I'm going to tell you about, as Krista said, one particular endeavor. The Institute for School Partnership, or ISP, has many programs. It's almost overwhelming, but you can see there's this orange little dot that's about curriculum. And so I'm here really just to talk to you about the curriculum development aspect as it relates to your end of the course project that you have the opportunity to develop a lesson yourself. So, I'm also mentioning a name that will become more familiar with you, I think next week, right? Krista, yeah, you're nodding your head, yes. Mary Beckendorf and I collaborated on the development of this COVID unit for her middle school students. It later became adapted more broadly into high school and down actually into fourth grade, as far down as fourth grade. But Mary and I work together. She's at the Hawthorne Leadership School for Girls, which is a charter school that Washington University sponsors and that I personally work with Mary on a monthly basis. She implements the curriculum that the ISP developed called mySci. And just like background information, further background information, the development of this unit started way back in March 2020. That is when the schools, actually March 17th was actually the very last day that schools were in session in the St. Louis area. Many schools, including the Hawthorne Leadership School for Girls, shifted their spring break a little bit to be after the shutdown so that they could use this time to prepare for distance learning. Really, this was the tiny bit of time that an entire profession had to learn an entirely new paradigm of teaching and learning through distance learning. And what Mary did, and many schools did in the area during this time, was create distance learning packets, which were literally like packets with paper that they sent home to students to sort of like hold their learning over for and act as a review for a couple of weeks. That was during the time when we were like, oh, this will pass. Well, it didn't. It didn't pass, guys. And from March 30th, you can see all the way through April 10th, Mary was holding virtual classes through Zoom and like learning how Zoom worked and trying to get kids logged in and trying to get kids Chromebooks because there was a huge inequity in terms of who had the technology. There were just a lot of issues. For those reasons and many others, attendance was really low. And so Mary and I met and planned on April 13th that the two of us would come into this Zoom room and just see how kids were doing and what kind of questions they had about the pandemic, which was a different topic than what we had been talking about before. So we gathered all of their questions through Google Jamboard. And I'm going to just pause and let you sort of like look over some of their questions. They're organized by color, they're color coded. So sixth grade questions are in yellow, or sorry, sixth grade questions are in green. Students who are in the seventh grade had questions in the blue, and eighth grade are in the yellow. So I hope you've gotten to read just maybe a handful of questions. I think this is going to be important because this is actually the start of how we developed the curriculum. And so I want to pull back the curtain a little bit for you all and talk to you about not just what we did, but sort of like open my brain to you and let you see what kind of factors went into the decisions that we made. And well, the decisions that we made to develop this curriculum, not just for Mary and her students, but ultimately we wanted to offer it to our entire St. Louis area that we serve. And we serve, I don't know, we serve tens of thousands of students. So, so it began. The curriculum development process began in April. And the criteria we were using, always with curriculum development, you want to start with the end in mind. So even if it's a lesson, even if you're designing just one activity, what do you hope students will do and learn by the end of that activity or by the end of a series of activities? So I'm using the word unit to mean a series of lessons. A lesson is just like a singular unit, a singular activity, I suppose. Many of us call this the learning objective. This should include a disciplinary core idea, which is taken from the National Science Standards, which is abbreviated there as NGSS. It should also include some kind of doing. There are 8 science and engineering practices that all K-12 students should be engaged with. And so some mix and match of those things should be part of your answer to question number 1. Our answer to this question was we wanted to engage students in those science and engineering practices in order to learn science ideas that would help them answer those questions from the previous slide. So I just want to be clear and say we were less concerned about, at that point, we were less concerned about them learning the prescribed ideas that were part of the National Science Standards. And we were more concerned about this latter part of like helping them regain some feelings of safety, intellectual safety, physical safety, and control, and just kind of like sustaining their joy for learning in those last few months in a pretty chaotic context. But there were still big public health ideas that we wanted them to learn. So just to summarize, it was those 8 engineering, science and engineering practices, students' questions that were on those previous slides. We wanted to use them as like on-ramps to begin the learning, to say like, hey, you asked these questions, let's try and answer these questions together. And we want them to learn. So there's a little bit of learning theory involved here, a model of conceptual change, and we'll talk about that in a second. Those key science ideas that help them answer their questions in a sort of like trauma-informed approach at the time. And still, I think that's important. Step 2, after thinking of the end, is to consider your constraints. What are they? At the time, and I still believe that this is an issue, is time. This was April, and there was only about a month of classes left. Materials, we provide kit materials for teachers to use with students so that they can engage in investigations. We couldn't do that during COVID when students were learning from home, and there were often technology issues associated with this. These three issues still exist today. There are many districts that are still in an 100% virtual environment, or some hybrid of in-person and remote, where they're being told from their district leaders that they cannot allow students to get out of their chairs, much less stand next to each other and manipulate materials together. So these are still constraints. This one more is capacity and motivation, like bandwidth. Everyone's creative energy is dwindling. Everyone's patience is dwindling. Teachers are very stressed out right now. So then the question is, okay, like if we have the end goal in mind, and we understand the constraints, how do we move from the end goal into the development of lessons that go in front of teachers and students? And the first step we did in doing this was to look at those students' questions, as you did just a minute ago, and look for themes that start to develop. And I hope you did notice some themes. And sort of try and make those themes, like give them a name and turn that into a question that could be posed to students to answer. And then organize those questions in a way that they can actually learn something, which involves an instructional model that I'll introduce to you in a minute. So these were the themes that we noticed. There was, in the upper left-hand corner, there's a lot of questions about like viruses in general, and like, is this something that's happened before? What is our history as humans with viruses and pandemics? There were a lot more questions about how COVID spreads and how to prevent COVID from spreading. You'll notice there's also like I didn't circle it, but who is impacted by the coronavirus is another really important question. I want to lift up the 7th grader who asked the question why Black people are dying at higher rates with COVID. So there is this social justice lens that that felt very crucial for Mary to pursue. And then over on the right, there are just a lot of questions about the future. Kids, and I mean, all of us were, especially at that time, were scared because this was so new, and nobody really knew what tomorrow would look like. So these were our buckets. These were our themes that we identified. We turned them into questions, and we were ready to organize them. So what we did is we took those 3 themes and sort of made those overarching questions, which are represented as Post-it notes here. And then we created a series of activities that engaged students in a cycle of inquiry in order to help give them empirical evidence and experiences in order to make claims that would answer the Post-it note questions. And so I'm going to just take the last number 3 here. What does the future look like? That learning cycle below, I want to just show you up close and personal what that is. So each one of those, you can see in the green, they all start with the letter E. And so this instructional model is known as the 5E instructional model for lesson development. And I'm sharing this with you because I think it's important for you to think about the bigger picture. If your activity, does it have an engaged purpose? An engaged purpose means that students are just sharing what they think and what their questions are, what they wonder about a particular science phenomenon. And teachers get to look at that, engage their prior knowledge. And that's important because any theory of learning includes the need to build new knowledge on existing knowledge. So you have to understand what the existing knowledge and experiences and languages are that kids are using in order to have a goal of learning. So the driving question board, the board with all the student sticky note questions, that was an engage lesson. That was one lesson that took about 45 to 60 minutes. And we did it virtually through Jamboard. But after that, we engaged them in an explore lesson. The purpose of an explore lesson is to actually get them doing some of those practices, like developing and using models, or analyzing data, or planning and carrying out investigations if they can with materials that they have at home. And they do these things in order to make sense of and to gather evidence, empirical evidence, that help them start answering those questions. So that's the empirical evidence part. Explain is where the theoretical understandings come into play. It's where the things that you learned here, you're learning here, or the things you've learned in your prior courses, your current courses, where you're like learning about laws and theories, right? Like Newton's laws of motion. It's like those sort of unobservable, theoretical, harder to understand conceptual components. That's really where that stuff is introduced, is in the explain, so that students have a scientific theory to attach to the empirical evidence that they experienced in order to make sense of it and understand it, and actually develop explanations for those Post-it note questions. Elaborate is a transfer purpose. It's like students get the opportunity to apply what they've learned in the explain and explore portions to a new context or a new situation. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And then evaluate, it is not exactly linear. Evaluate is really the assessment part, is like, what kind of information does the teacher have to know what students know? It gives students an opportunity to demonstrate what they've learned and what they've done. And so this is just an example. I have links here, and I'll share this slide deck with you, Krista, to make sure everyone has access to it. But in that third cycle, when kids are looking at this question, what does the future look like and how do we know? They start with the driving question board, which this little picture over here is to say that this was a synchronous activity, the same way that you and I, we're like all together in the same room virtually right now. And then the explore, explain, and elaborate were done by students individually on their own asynchronously. And then we came back to the driving question board during the evaluate at the end of this 5E learning cycle. But students got a chance in the Explore to look at the Spanish flu of 1918 in order to answer a lot of their historical based questions, but also to look at infection curves. And specifically Philadelphia's infection curve was very different than St. Louis's infection curve during this 1918 Spanish flu. And that's because Philadelphia threw a party in the middle of a pandemic, and St. Louis had a little bit more tighter restrictions. And so students were sort of analyzing data to explore ideas, to explore like how we might be able to prevent something from like Philadelphia experienced in the future. In the explain, they actually get information, like a reading about how scientists use models to predict the future. In the elaborate, students write arguments based on the Imperial London College London's initial and revised projections. So that's the application to a new context, that's a different context. And the evaluate actually happens in all of those. So for example, I'm going to just click on the student page here, and you can see these little boxes. These are opportunities, they're questions that kids have to answer. And so these are assessment opportunities. And there's a little scaffold here that students can use for claim evidence reasoning. So yeah, that is just an example. And then there are the logistical components. That was really like the meat and potatoes of the unit development work, of the lesson development work. The logistical parts, the parts that go back to teachers and students, well, teachers in this case, having low bandwidth and just like They just need the things that help them do the work. Is like they need student pages, what I just shared with you now, that are student facing, that don't have the answers, that phrase questions in a way that students can understand them. And they need a teacher guide. They need something that provides guidance for how to implement the activity. So it contains time, like this will take 45 minutes. The materials required, this will require water and access to the internet. Connection to any kind of science and engineering practices that students will be doing, because teachers are expected to communicate that to their administrators. They need to prove that they're building towards the national standards. And then also student pages with the answers. So it's like the same thing that I just showed you with the empty boxes needs to be part of the teacher guide, but with boxes that are filled with the answers, so that teachers know where they're going, where to sort of like push them when they're in the explain part or in the explore part. And a Google slideshow like what I have here is always, it's optional, but it can be helpful. I just wanted to share this with you in terms of Mary, who will be coming next week, and this unit. She had 2 weeks of class virtually before this unit. And then we did this unit for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, she had higher rates of attendance, increased student participation, more kids actually participating live, more submitted work through her Google Classroom, and kids showing up to her Zoom class an hour before it started to talk about how COVID was how COVID was impacting their lives. So a safe space. And so I think that's important. And we shared this unit more broadly with the entire St. Louis community. Many found it helpful. Many took it and adapted it. One district went on a virtual field trip. This picture is of, I can't pronounce his last name, Brett Marique. He's a Washington University genetics professor who volunteered to get a COVID test done with students watching so that they could see and like remove the stigma of COVID tests that everyone heard, oh, it hurts, right? I don't want to get a COVID test. And the gentleman on the right is Ken Griffin. He is the COO of the St. Louis County Department of Public Health. And he's also a Black man. And I think that's really important, especially in our underserved, under-resourced communities where there are many students of color who don't get to see people of color in these prominent sorts of positions all the time. And so that was another nice benefit of this little virtual field trip. And I won't go through all these, but I just want to show in terms of your lesson development work, I know that you can really choose any topic that you discuss here in this course. I also want to share, I guess, maybe questions that come straight from the mouths of middle school students so that you can see how they're phrased. You can understand this unit was great, but it didn't answer all of their questions. They have a lot more that we didn't get to answer. And so if your lessons that you're thinking about developing, if you want them to do work, if you want them to have impact, if you want them to actually be used by teachers, I think you increase the likelihood of that happening by pursuing by making lessons around some of these questions. And so there are a lot of questions about COVID in general, but also COVID testing and COVID and vaccines. That's the new biggest thing. And how herd immunity works, what are COVID variants, like what is that? Will we have COVID forever? Are we just doomed to be living with COVID? You know, like these are just some kid questions that I think are important for us as adults to consider. in this work. So I would love to answer any questions that any of you have. I see there's a lot.
There are a lot. That's great. Thank you very much. So I want to start with some logistical questions about planning. So you mentioned at different points in your presentation, for example, this is a lesson that takes 45 minutes. How can students try and figure out how long a lesson that they're developing will take? They've been asked to create something that's 30 to 60 minutes long, but having not worked in a classroom before, how will they know how to figure out how much time to allow for a given activity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I honestly, we still are grappling with that. The curriculum mySci that we've created. Do you want me to stop sharing my screen?
Sure, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. So the curriculum that we've developed, we are still getting feedback from teachers that are like, it's taking way longer than that. So I've been in curriculum development for over 10 years. So that's not an easy question to answer. I just generally think that whatever you think it will take, it will take twice as long because of the classroom routines that are invisible to people like you and me that aren't in the classroom. There's attendance, there's like waiting for everybody to show up, there's people sitting in their seats, there's usually some kind of a starter, like a bell ringer question that they have to do to get everybody to settle in. And then, equitable participation is really important. So wait time is a thing where it just like all of these things add up to take a lot longer than what you would think they take.
Yeah, and I will say that the 30 to 60 minute idea was really to emphasize that we're not expecting them to develop an entire, unit like you did, because we shared with them what you provided us, which is really many lessons in one.
Right.
So we won't, to the students, we won't worry so much about how many minutes it actually takes, but rather don't try and, do a week's worth of lessons or a month's worth of lessons. Just focus on trying to do one lesson. Great. Okay, so another time question is how long, when you're developing these types of lessons, so let's say you're creating a lesson that's meant to be, just one lesson for students, how long usually, how many hours do you put into creating that lesson? How much time should students allocate for designing these lesson plans?
That's a good question too. So if you think about the decision-making that went into that unit, I mean, it's like you said, you're not developing a unit. And I think that gives you a lot more flexibility because you don't have to then think about connecting it to the previous things that they've done. It's just, it can be a standalone thing that they do. And so, the fact that you would have to think of the learning goal, identify the time and materials required, develop the student page and the teacher page that have that explain the activity. Those are like, I think those are really the things that you would need to consider. And so don't overthink it. Make it make it a day of work.
Yep, that's great advice. Good. Okay, and then the sticky notes that you put up that were questions from the students, I think that was very striking, and we had several questions and comments about that. One person said, it's interesting and also sad to see that sixth graders are contemplating who's a reliable source of information. And they also asked, looking at some of the eighth grader questions, they seemed more fatalistic. And so how do you address that sort of pessimism, that you see in the questions when you're trying to teach? Are there strategies for how you can take a situation that is really difficult, and actually I'm going to have multiple questions similar to this, but
Yeah.
one in particular is about, how do you address their pessimism in your teaching?
Yeah, that's a great question. And can I share a link with you
Yeah,
somehow,
please.
like in the chat or
So
something?
the chat won't, I can, if you share it with me, then I can share it with everyone.
Okay, so I'll share it with you. Here is, so here is a link that teachers talk about this aspect of teaching and learning in general as social emotional learning, which is really helping kids recognize and understand the causes and consequences of their emotions and label them and express them in a way that's healthy and give them strategies to regulate those emotions. And so this is an example of that, of how one teacher took this COVID unit as an opportunity to really dig into these social emotional learning goals. And this is a 6th grade, I think it was actually shared between 6th, 7th, and 8th grade classes, but this was actually here in University City, the school district of University City, talking about disappointment and versus expectations. And like how if we set ourselves up to have certain expectations and the reality is different than our expectations, that tends to lead to feelings of like disappointment and anger and sadness. And so I think that's one way that teachers have been dealing with this. Another way is, like I mentioned, Mary, who will be with you next week, holding her Zoom space open, literally is just saying, hey, you're an hour early. Can I help you? And so it's sort of like virtual office hours. And she created a breakout room for 2 students, one whose father died of COVID and another whose father was shot and killed the previous week, to discuss their pain and the difference between a death that is by murder and a death that is by a health inequity issue. And so I that's a really good question.
Yeah, well, I will share, so we'll share this resource that you just shared with me on the Canvas page. And I think that will help get at a lot of the questions that students had about, how a lot of the questions are about dealing with mental health. You're talking about these difficult issues with students. So I think it seems like this resource will help with that. And also related to that, I guess, did you find that there were certain things about the pandemic that you had to be careful about how you talked about it when dealing with middle school students as opposed to what you would say to adults, because it's so emotionally draining? Are there certain strategies for dealing with that?
Yeah, well, I think it's important not to avoid it. I think that is the biggest strategy. I think teachers need opportunities to learn strategies for how to, and this was the last list of things that helped us make decisions around this unit. It was a trauma-informed approach. And a trauma-informed approach really is about like promoting a sense of safety, psychological safety, physical safety, trustworthiness through transparency, and like you don't lie if you don't know something, you say you don't know something. That goes back to like not trusting sources of information, including family. And so like we have in the COVID module, one of the activities is to interview their parents, or to interview, another one was interviewing an essential worker who could not quarantine at home. to ask them questions about how they stay safe and how they feel that they cannot stay at home. I think it's important to, I think if this is a thing, perspective taking is an important thing to ask students to do. And, you know, the question about being really careful around students versus teachers, it's like, I think it's both, actually. I think teachers are experiencing many of the same trauma, and I think a huge part of their professional identity has been taken from them, and that is like being with students and developing relationships with students in person, and like that's really hard. It's been really hard. There's just a huge wave of apathy and just like low energy right now. And a strategy, I don't know if this helps, but a strategy I use, I work with a lot of teachers in this environment, and I always open with an activity that honors everybody's humanness. And that's usually something that's like a meditative thing, or a contemplative practice, or something fun and funny, and like you don't have to think very hard, or some kind of a social emotional thing where I'm just simply asking them to check in with how they're feeling and share that with me.
Yep. That's great. I'm glad you mentioned the trauma-informed approach, because some students were specifically asking about that. So I appreciate you listing off some of those tips for things to think about. So I want to take this in a different direction so we can have a little bit less serious questions for a time. So one thing from a logistical standpoint, students are wondering, when you're designing these lesson plans, you came up with this unit where you were trying to hit on a bunch of different standards. When they're looking at designing their lesson plans, and we provided them with the K through 12 standards that you had shared with me, to what extent do they have to try and include everything that falls under a particular lesson plan or a particular standard, like everything in the, the orange and the green and the blue boxes? And to what extent can they just hit on some of those?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I can't remember the exact colors. I think there are 3 different colors though. There's orange, blue, and green. Mm-hmm. And the one that represents cross-cutting concepts, you have not heard that phrase come from my mouth, because I don't think it's important in the scope of like, I'm just developing a lesson. So really it's about the practices, what kids are doing in your lesson and what they're learning in their lesson. And I personally, and I think the science education field writ large cares more about kids doing those 8 practices, like that they should be obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. Like to answer the question about trusted resources, they need to evaluate different kinds of information sources. And so I would say, make that a requirement in your mind, like that your activity should do one of those 8 things, just one of those 8 things. And that the thing that they learn, I lean more towards it should answer one of these students' questions than it should address a disciplinary core idea in those standards, like that other column.
Yep. Okay, great. And students were also wondering if you have any feelings about what grade is the hardest to design for.
I have a very readily available answer. Kindergarten through 2nd grade is it's the beast, man. It's so hard. It's like, there's so little. Can you just imagine trying, I mean, maybe you don't have to imagine, maybe some of you have children that are this age where you've, are related to or friends with, and you've heard stories about how difficult it is to get those kids to just sit down and be in their virtual class. Yeah, it's really hard to design a curriculum and to really to teach it through a virtual environment.
Yes, and I'm glad you said that. Since you had told me that, we included in the instructions that that's the hardest to design for, but I think we should reiterate that, because I think also it's, for some people, it's the most enticing one to do something for, because it, you know, seems fun. But yeah, exactly. When you're trying to teach something, you need students that will sit still or somehow be able to be engaged with the activities.
Yeah.
So on that note, students are wondering, what types of learning activities do middle school students seem to enjoy the most?
Yeah. Well, they love experiments. It's the stuff they can do with their hands. And unfortunately, that's the stuff that's hardest to do in a virtual environment, but that's the science and engineering practice that is, I don't remember the number, but it's the one that says planning and carrying out an investigation. That is like the coolest thing for kids to do. Yeah.
Awesome. That's great. So a related question is, given that teachers have had to come up with kind of out of the box ideas for lesson plans during the pandemic, are there any examples that you can think of that really stand out as a great way to handle lesson plans during this pandemic? And related to that, are there some of those that have been developed that you think now will stick around even once we're back in the classroom?
Can you, like, so specific activities that have been developed that will stick around, or?
Yeah, or types of interactions maybe also. I mean, I would say these are really two questions. So one is, do you have any examples of really successful lesson plans or, you know, activities? And then the other question is, are there certain things that have been implemented in schools that seem like they're worth keeping around after the pandemic is over?
Yeah. So the first question, I think there have, because you need a phenomenon, a scientific phenomenon, something that, an event or a process that is puzzling, and it's a scientific process that is occurring in the world that students know about, like that's the hook, and it's the thread, it's the through line throughout a series of lessons. Like, it's been really difficult to well, I guess actually that is the thing I think that has stayed the same. And now that I'm saying this out loud, that was important, and like having that phenomenon there was important and present before COVID, during COVID, and hopefully will be there afterwards. Like that's a sustaining thing. But I think the ways in which students investigate in order to learn more about that phenomenon has changed. And the thing that I think feels most successful is this idea of taking an investigation that was made for the classroom and asking students to find material substitutions at home to do that work with. An example being, like, we had these inflatable globes with a flashlight to talk about the seasons, the tilt of the earth, and rotation versus revolution around the sun. And, you know, students didn't have those inflatable globes. And so a teacher just said, okay, your homework tonight is to get something round and bring it to class tomorrow. And everyone showed up with like an orange. One kid had a balled up sock, like a sock that he brought, and was like, that's my thing. And so that's how they talked about rotation and revolution. And I think, I mean, that scrappiness, I hope it has been a good thing. And another thing that I think is here to stay is the technology aspect. I think teachers are just they've gone so deep down that hole of like Nearpod, what I shared with you, and Flipgrid. And I mean, there's just so many different tools that I think that those things will stay in some capacity, even when we come back to school.
Yeah, I like the, oops, sorry, I'm echoing, I think. I like the example you give of the orange and the sock. One of the students was asking, you know, is it best to design lessons that use readily available household materials? And I think what that example that you gave actually points out that you shouldn't assume everybody has the same thing in their households. So it's like the answer is yes, and also make it general enough that everyone can find something.
Yeah, yes, that's a great, yes. Those kinds of lessons are the best. And equitable access to round things is, I mean, like that's an it's an access issue, equitable access issue. And I think it's a great idea.
Excellent. And then some students were wondering, is it better to have a certain mode or, you know, a certain way that you're delivering information or that the lesson is being delivered and stick with that throughout? Or is it good to mix it up? So in other words, do you mix like a written lesson with a video, with a hands-on experiment? Or do you design something where it's written and you stick with one thing? What's the better strategy in terms of keeping students engaged, but not confusing them too much?
Yeah, I would parse those apart even more and think about what are the kids doing versus like, what is the modality of their doing? So what are they doing? It should be one of the science and engineering practices. If they're reading something, that means they're obtaining information. If they're looking at graphs like the incidence curves, that they're analyzing and interpreting data. It's like the doing is the mixing up of activities. It's like they could be looking at a graph one day and then watching a video and drawing a model of that video. Like here's an example of one. My kids started erasing it, but I was just drawing, like, it was air hockey, and I was trying to draw like communicate how forces were involved in, like, when you hit the ball like this versus when you tap it like this, like what happens to the puck and how much kinetic energy the puck has. And so that's developing and using models. That's a practice kids should be doing. They should be grabbing pens and pencils and drawing what they're trying to say. That's mixing it up. The modality is how they're doing that. And it could be that they're drawing. It could be that, they have to watch a video because the thing that they were going to do in person doesn't, like, you can't do it in person anymore. Like, so they have to watch a video instead, or a simulation. So an example of that is, sticking with the physics example, when good old potential energy versus kinetic energy, like looking at roller coaster rides, when you go up the hill, and then you've got your maximum potential energy, and you're starting to convert that potential energy into kinetic energy as you go down. Students are actually given materials to build roller coasters in the classroom, and they can't do that when they're not in the classroom. And so we replace those with simulations. A really great resource is PhET. Have you heard of PhET? I can share this with you if you haven't. It's out of Colorado, and it's sort of like that experience, but in a computer simulation, and writing and drawing. And I think Flipgrid has been a really great tool to think about how students' writing can be thought about through video. Like, actually they can record themselves talking, and like that teachers realize they get more kids turning in more work if they can ask a kid to videotape themselves talking through the rotation and revolution of their round thing, versus if they're requiring a Google sheet, like they have to fill in the words and then submit it. So those are different modalities to consider.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking that maybe one thing we could do is I can just get a list from you of all of these new technologies and applications that it sounds like help to make this online learning environment more interesting for the students. And we can add that to our Canvas page, and then students can explore that a little bit as well.
Yeah.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So another question that students have is, how do you handle the fact that students may be learning very different things at home than what they're learning at school? And we've seen with COVID that some of these are things that people feel pretty strongly about and can be kind of polarizing. So how do you take that into account at all? Or how do you design your lessons when you may have students who are the children of anti-vaxxers, for example, in your classroom?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the slides that I'll share with you link to some activities that take into consideration that very thing, and actually pose it to students and say, the College Imperial London report, this was so long ago, you guys, I don't even know if you remember this, but they put out a report that said something like 500,000 lives would be lost according to their models, their SIR models, their mathematical models. And then they changed an assumption based on the fact that the UK started putting things in place to restrict the people moving around. And so they changed their model, and then the projections, lo and behold, it's like not 500,000 people will die. It's much lower. And that, in response to that, people were very distrustful of science, of scientists, and didn't feel like anything coming out of like the CDC and other places were reliable sources of information. And so that, like, we made a reading about this, and we called out this idea of like the very human phenomenon of like what happens when your expectations around what science is and what it's supposed to be, which is like infallible information and it doesn't change, and it's like, you know, hard facts, that's not actually true. It's not actually how science works, especially when you're thinking of frontier science, which is science that is still being figured out. And I think so I don't know, I guess that's such a good question. And it's something I myself personally grapple with all the time, is probably like why I'm in science in the first place, science education in the first place. But I don't think you can ignore how people feel. I think it's really actually closely related to this idea of taking a trauma-informed approach, or like thinking about people's social emotional lives, that like you cannot, their feelings are tied up in this. People are feeling a certain way. And so just like helping people, and I'm saying that to include both teachers and students, because we've also had teachers that fall into this category, science teachers, to recognize this as a phenomenon, and that like helps them see that they have control over changing their minds. And I don't know, I think we really pay attention. We want to pay attention to how the nature of science, the epistemology of science, how science comes into being, and like how scientific knowledge claims get made. And I think it's part of the slides that I've shared about like how scientists know, how they predict the future. It's like it's not a certain thing. You can't put all of your expectations on that one prediction, and if it changes, you will be, yeah, you'll be mad, you'll be angry, you'll be sad, I don't know, distrustful, all of those things.
Yes, absolutely. That's difficult also, dealing with educators who are resistant to these ideas. So I wanted to share a comment from one of the students related to, you were mentioning PhET, is that how you say it?
Yes.
Okay, and they said, not a question, but just wanted to say that PhET is actually super awesome, lots of cool sciencey simulations. So that's great. We'll get a list of, yes, big thumbs up. We'll get a list of some of these tools that you recommend, and we'll add them to our Canvas page. Another student was asking what they can do to support teachers and reduce their workload. And Heather, as you know, the whole reason that I reached out to you and designed this activity for the students is to try and get this large class to help with that, for anyone who's willing to share their lessons after they turn them in. So they ask, are there certain functions that teachers will be expected to perform going forward, which they weren't responsible for before? Or are there other ways in which you think that we as a class, in the work that we're doing, or just the public in general, could help teachers?
Oh, wow. I think that's a really good question to ask Mary. I will answer it myself, but I want you to also think about posing that same question to her, because she's in it and I'm not. Or I am peripherally. I think making it what you guys are doing by thinking about it in terms of just one lesson and like one piece of an idea, not you don't have to teach them. In one lesson, you're not going to communicate herd immunity. Okay. Like just a little piece of that maybe. And that in and of itself, I think will be really helpful, because it's so chaotic still. Like, for example, Ferguson-Florissant School District had voted to go back into the classroom after the whole year teaching virtually. And so teachers are stressed because they cannot wrap their brains around how to simultaneously teach to a virtual classroom while also having students in their classroom at the same time. And so, like, I think these bite-sized lessons are going to be helpful, because it's something that teachers can plug and play. And I just think that that's the most helpful thing we can do right now.
Excellent. So you've given us some examples of what middle school students are interested in and need. Do you have some suggestions about high school students and what sort of questions they have and what sort of lessons would work well for them?
Yeah, actually somebody might be here who is who taught this unit in high school. I shared the link with her. I'm not sure if she's here, but she shared with me what her students, the opening question to this unit is, how has your life been impacted by COVID? And she shared those with me, and it feels really similar to the slide that I have of all of the questions around vaccines, spreadability, also the trustworthiness of news. I think they're versions of these same questions. So I think that's why I focus on middle school, is because it's a nice, what do you call it, cross-section, kind of representative of like lower grades, but also upper grades. They just might word it differently.
Yeah, that's great. And so when we're thinking about how to design lessons that could be used in a bunch of different schools that have different access to resources, are there any tips for thinking about that and making sure that it's broadly accessible?
Well, I can help with the dissemination. So the sort of the links you've already shared, Krista, to all of the resources, it's through the Institute for School Partnership website. And like we can, what I'd like to do is eventually use some of these lessons that answer some questions that have gone unanswered, to plug those into the existing COVID unit, because that's already in a virtual platform where teachers can access that. So that's like the dissemination piece. But in terms of the design, I think two things, like the required parts of a lesson plan, you know, for teachers, like I said, is the teacher guide, the student pages, but it's like that list of things in the teacher guide, the connection to the standards, like what are kids doing, those science and engineering practices. And then if it does connect to a standard, like a disciplinary core idea, that's always helpful, because teachers are expected to teach all of those standards, and students are tested on those standards in 8th grade, well, in 5th grade and 8th grade and 10th and 12th grades. So that the standard, and then also the assessment piece. So like those blank boxes where students get to write, you can think about it not necessarily needing to always be a blank box. Like it doesn't always need to be a short answer type of question. You know, you can think about it, different ways of getting information from students. There was that Jamboard with Post-it notes. There's also more test-like ways of asking questions, like multiple choice. You know, like you can think about that too. That I think those things would be helpful. Having a variety of ways you ask questions. And I don't mean like a variety within a lesson plan. I think if there are, I don't know, let's say 100 different lesson plans, and like 50 of them have open-ended questions and 25 have some multiple choice, like that would be nice.
Excellent. And so what about when we think about students with disabilities? Are there, are the lesson plans that are being created then adapted for students with different types of disabilities, or do specific lesson plans need to be created? What are tips for that?
I think if you have in mind, the designer of the lesson, if you have in mind something, some kind of, we call those differentiation strategies. So if you have in mind a way that lesson could be modified or differentiated, adapted, whatever, to meet the needs of students with learning differences or different physical abilities, then please include those. You know, in the teacher guide, there's like a margin that is like teacher tips. You know, if you use that as a model, literally it's in Google. So you can make a copy of that thing and just use that as your template. Include that there. Otherwise, that's something that we work with teachers very closely with during their professional development, because they know their kids best. And so helping them brainstorm and think of ways to adapt a lesson to meet the needs of all of their students is really like that professional intellectual work that we want teachers doing. And that does not have to be written into the curriculum.
Okay, great. That makes sense. So then a lot of what you developed before was based on, you know, what was happening last year, I guess. And as we know, information with this pandemic moves so quickly. So students are wondering what is now the most important information that students are concerned about. You mentioned vaccines, you mentioned variants of concern, but students are wondering if you could give a little more information about the specific types of questions that students have now. Like, for example, one student was asking, have students been asking why they aren't able to get vaccinated? Do they understand why vaccines are only being given to adults? Do they feel neglected because they're not part of that distribution plan? So in terms of responding to that question, then also just other things that you've heard students are really interested in now.
Yeah. Those two slides on 22 and 23 are the slide, like it's that work. I've done that work and put them on those slides. So it's like, these are the questions that are more relevant now because they came from students' mouths in January than the questions with all the Post-it notes that came from students' mouths in April or May. And so those questions, like you said, involve, I think that the one you mentioned is a really good one of like, when do I get my vaccine and why is a great question. And even if it's like the activity that you designed to answer that question involves like going to the CDC and reading something and asking questions about that reading, like that is a lesson. I just want people to know that. It doesn't have to be this thing that's always hands-on. That's obtaining information from reliable sources. Other questions are, I really think a question that got glossed over is how COVID came into existence. And like, I think there are still really potentially harmful misconceptions that are like racialized misconceptions around how COVID happened. And like, that's a subject that I don't hear kids asking that anymore, but I do think that it's worth thinking about. Other questions are like, can kids spread it because they're being told that schools can continue to be open? Like, so does that mean that kids can't spread the disease? That's related to like why they're not getting a vaccine right away. What makes some masks better than others? Things that connect to them. Can you get COVID more than once? What's in a vaccine? I had a child ask, is there cancer cells in vaccines? I think it's like really, or even just part of that question is like, what is a vaccine? What is that liquid in the syringe that goes into your arm? You know, like that, yeah. And then another question is like, what does my body do with that liquid once it's in me? Like what's part of it? Yeah.
Yes, I think those sorts of questions, especially because it's a different type of vaccine, right? So I think vaccines in general, vaccine development in general, and also then this particular type of vaccine, I think those are really great topics that students, I'm sure, will want to know more about. And there's so much basic science underlying that really opens up the opportunity to teach these, you know, very clear, this very clear scientific information. So yeah, that's wonderful. And I appreciate you mentioning where COVID came from originally. I think that's something we've talked a little bit about in this class, but definitely in the original, the Pandemic Science and Society class, we talked multiple times about, you know, being careful about the language that we use, being aware of what a wet market actually is, and that they're not necessarily the problem, but rather uncontrolled wildlife sale is the issue. You know, using the term illegal hunting instead of poaching, and wild animal meat instead of bush meat, things like this, like where language really does matter. And it does feel like we've just kind of glossed over a lot of that, and people's assumptions about where COVID came from kind of never got addressed. So it's a good point that there are some of these issues that happened before that we actually need to go back to and address a little better. That's great. So a lot of students have been asking about mental health. And I mean, you talked about the social emotional learning and trauma-informed approach, but I think a lot of students have questions about, you know, the mental health impacts of virtual learning, mental health impacts for students during this whole pandemic. And I think are kind of wondering if that's something that's, aside from the social emotional learning and the trauma-informed approach, is that something that's directly being addressed or that can that can or should be addressed in the lessons that they're designing?
Yeah. Okay. And the lessons that they're designing.
Or if you,
I think it
if you
can.
know, okay, or if you know of ways that it's being addressed or what's being done about that generally for students.
Yeah, that's a great question that I don't have a good answer to. And I wonder again if this is a good question for Mary. Because in my mind, what that makes me think of is the fact that there are mental health professionals in schools, but I have no idea how they're, I don't know how they are able to provide services virtually. How are schools thinking about their school counselors? How are they thinking about their teachers' mental health? Certainly I haven't seen a systematic effort to do, like has not been action that I've seen in districts that make me go, oh yeah, this is something people are doing. I think it's but I do think it's necessary. It's something that at the Institute for School Partnership, we are trying to practice. That we have a book club on cultivating emotional resilience in educators, and like we're trying to, I think this is connected to our mental health, is like how we're feeling. And like why, I think it's like asking, why am I feeling this way? And like what are the strategies that help us resist and like be emotionally resilient and resist burnout and like go through the stress cycle instead of being stuck in the stress cycle. Teaching is a care-based profession, just as healthcare is a care-based profession. It's just, different. Healthcare, psychiatrists, psychologists are required to have their own psychiatrist and psychologist. And that's not true for healthcare workers and teachers, but I think it should be. In terms of your lesson plans though, I just, y'all, I love your questions, and you're so passionate about this and you want to help. And like, I don't want to dampen that at all, but I also don't want you to think about this project as being so much bigger than it really is. So like, there's the tension there, right? It's like, yes, all of these things are important. But like really focus on, like, create boundaries around what the project is and work within those boundaries. And like, maybe it's an opening. Like you can think of a lesson as having an opening, the middle meat, like the activity thing, and then like a closing. This is how teachers think of lessons. And usually the opening is a bell ringer question that they ask students, and like maybe that's related to mental health. Or I can also share my email with you, Krista, and like continue having this bigger conversation as like a separate one.
That's wonderful. Thank you. But I think that's great advice. The idea here is not for each student in this class to solve this issue, but just for us all to contribute. Because if everybody just did a little bit in general in this world, we would actually be in a much better place, right?
Yeah, it's true.
So, we only have a minute left, so I just want to ask you one last question. If there are any words of advice, either related to what we've been talking about this whole time, or just generally, if you have any words of advice for the students.
I think it was probably what I mentioned before, with like just really focusing on what is the assignment, what is the task, and thinking of other sort of like passion projects beyond the task, coming to Krista with that, and maybe there are other opportunities to collaborate with the Institute for School Partnership. We're connected to pretty much every school district within an hour's drive from here. And, if you have an idea, we can talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end. I mean, there are lots of talented students in this class, and the fact that WashU has these resources to connect with the community, I think we want to encourage that as much as possible. So
Absolutely.
thank you very much. This has been really wonderful, and I appreciate you being here. We are now at time, so for everyone else, I will see you next week. Until then, stay safe.